In this section, we'll be adding animations. We'll learn how to animate in Cinema 4D, how to use the Puppet tool, how to work with advanced pins in the Puppet tool, and how to do keyframe interpolation. In this video, we'll keep going with our title and animate a camera in Cinema 4D. In Cinema 4D, click on Camera 1 to make sure it's selected. This is the one we'll animate. Down in the timeline, I'm going to move my current timeline indicator to 60 so that I can capture this as my final frame. Down in the Object panel, make sure your Coordinates option is selected. I'll click on the key to start recording activity, and notice that adds red dots next to the coordinates. I'll bring my current time indicator all the way back to the beginning. I want to move my camera up and maybe a little bit more to the right. Now that I have it into position, I'm going to click on all of the orange circles to make sure they're red dots. Now I can scrub through my timeline, and you'll see that I've animated my title. I'll save, and back in After Effects, you'll see that my title updates. If I scrub through here, the animation I just did is reflected. In the next video, we'll look at the Puppet tool. In this video, we'll look at the Puppet tool and how to animate characters. The first thing we want to do is import the shark file, so I'll right-click on my Projects panel and choose Import File, and select the shark.png file in the Chapter 4 folder. I'll drag it to the top of my composition and twirl open the options so that I can scale it down. Next, I want to move my current time indicator to the very beginning of the animation because when we turn on the Puppet tool pins, it'll automatically start recording animations. I'll switch over to my Puppet tool, and for now we're going to start with the position pin. Now notice I'm using a transparent PNG, meaning there's no white background behind the shark. You'll want to use transparent PNGs to get the effects you would expect with the Puppet tool. I'll start adding pins to the shark, and you're going to want to add pins to places that bend, as well as places you want to control. Here I've added 4 pins to the shark. Next, with the shark layer selected, I'm going to type the letter U on the keyboard. This brings up all the active options for your layer. To animate the shark, I'll move the current time indicator to 10 frames, and I'll move his tail up. So with the pen tool still selected, I'll click on the pin that I added to the end of the tail, and I'll move it up. I'll move to 20 frames, and move the pin down. At 30 frames, or 1 second, I'll move the pin back to the middle to create a loop that begins and ends at approximately the same spot in the middle. Now that we have an animation that starts and ends in the same place, I'll want to select those keyframes by clicking and dragging over them, copy them with Command-C or Control-C if you're on a PC, move to 1 second 10 frames, and paste using Command-V or Control-V if you're on a PC. I'll keep doing that until I have several keyframes where the shark is swimming. Next, we're going to have our shark stretch and squash as if he's taking off quickly. I'll move the current time indicator to about 3 seconds, and I'll add keyframes for all 4 pins. I'll move my current time indicator to 3 seconds and 20 frames, and also add keyframes. In between those keyframes, at about 3 seconds and 10 frames, I want to squash my shark. So I'll shift-click on the 2 pins on the tail and move them in, and click on the pin at the nose and move it in. Later, we'll adjust the shark so that it swims on and off screen. And in the next video, we'll take a look at advanced pins. In this video, we'll look at the advanced pins for the Puppet tool. In the same way we started with the previous video, we'll import the mermaid file. We'll drag it to the top of the comp, twirl open the mermaid layer options, and scale the mermaid down. We'll add pins to the mermaid, but before we do, we want to make sure that our current time indicator is all the way back to the beginning, because again, when you use the puppet tool, it automatically turns on those keyframes. I'll zoom in to move the arm into view. This time I'll use the Puppet Advanced Pin tool, which allows you to control position, rotation, and scale. I'll use the Advanced Pin tool in her elbows, her wrists, and her shoulder. I'll do the same on the other side. Now we're going to add regular position pins on either side of the advanced pin so that we can control those portions of her arm. Next, I'm going to jump ahead to 10 frames and move her arm inward. It'll look funny at first, but we'll adjust it. Now the first problem I see is that the arm is behind her and I want it in front. To fix that, we switch over to the Puppet Overlap Pin tool, and this will reveal an outline of the original shape. I'll click on the hand, and you'll notice these white shapes show up. This can be controlled by the extend, and I want to up the extend until it covers most of the hand. I'll add another pin here, and possibly down here if we missed an area. Now you'll see that the whole forearm is in front. I'll switch back to the Position Pin tool and adjust my pins. Clicking on the Advanced Pin tool, you'll see if I hover over the green circle, I can rotate the image just a little bit to straighten it out. I'll also move pins near her elbow and do the same on the other side. I'll jump ahead to 30 frames and move her arms out. Finally, I'll select the mermaid layer and type the letter U on the keyboard to reveal all of the active frames. I'll copy the very first set of frames and jump ahead to frame 40 and paste. Now that we have a loop, you can continue copying and pasting the keyframes all the way through the clip to make her look like she's waving her arms in the water. Additionally, I want to add some pins to her tail, so I'll move my current time indicator all the way back, put a pin at the base of the tail and the end of the tail. I'll jump ahead 10 frames, move the tail right, jump ahead 20 frames, move the tail left, jump ahead to frame 30, and bring it back to the center. Again, you can copy and paste these keyframes all across the composition like we did with the shark to make it look like her tail's swimming. I'll use my space bar to switch to the hand tool and do some animation in her hair. Next, I'll add some animation to her hair by going back to the very beginning, adding a pin to her forehead to keep it stable, and then to the bends in her hair. I'll jump ahead 10 frames, hold my Shift key to select multiple pins, jump ahead to frame 20, until the end of the composition. In the next video, we'll take a look at keyframe interpolation. In this video, we'll look at keyframe interpolation. Now that we have some animations, we're going to look at keyframe interpolation, which simply means After Effects' ability to interpret movement between two keyframes. For this exercise, we're going to focus on the area of the shark animation that does the squash and the stretch. I'll hold my Shift key and select the keyframes down below as well. Now, before we modify these keyframes, let's turn on the graph editor and see what they look like. You'll see that they're kind of square and creates kind of a mechanical movement. I'll turn the graph editor off. And if you right-click on one of the keyframes, you'll see you have the keyframe assistant, and I want you to choose Easy Ease. This not only changes the shape of my keyframes, but if you go back to the graph editor, you'll see that the movements are now curved. So they gradually speed up and then slow down as the movement happens. We're going to adjust this just a little bit to give the movement a little bit more snap. I'll grab the handle down here at the bottom of the keyframe interpolation, and I'll sharpen the curve just a little bit. This will give the squash and stretch animation a little bit more of a pop. In this section, we've looked at animating in Cinema 4D, we've looked at the puppet tool and its advanced pins, and finally we looked at keyframe interpolation. In the next section, we'll look at more effects and wrap things up. In this section, we'll take a look at some more effects and wrap up our promo video. We'll learn how to adjust layers, how to work with timing, and how to animate effects. In this video, we'll change the composition of our project by adjusting the layers. For the promo video, I want the stingray to come on first, then the title, and then the mermaid and shark. So I'll scrub through the timeline and see that the stingray starts to go off the screen at about 4 seconds, which is when I want the title and my byline to come on. I'll shift-click on the title and my byline and move it to 4 seconds. At 8 seconds, I want my mermaid to be fully on screen, so I'll select the layer, tap the letter P for position, and add a keyframe. And I want her off the screen at about 7 seconds. So I'll move my CTI, or current time indicator, to 7 seconds, and then I'll move her off screen. Once my title is fully visible at about 7 seconds, I'll animate the shark on screen. So again, I'll type the letter P for position. I'll turn on the position keyframe, move him off screen, and then move my current time indicator to 9 seconds. I'll then drag him across the screen until he's off screen. And now I'll see that he moves across the screen. Next, I want the shark to turn around and come back. To do that, I'll split the layer by typing Command-Shift-D or Control-Shift-D if you're on a PC. I'll right-click on the off-screen shark and choose Transform, Flip Horizontal. Additionally, on my top shark image, I'll select the keyframes, right-click, and choose Keyframe Assistant, Time Reverse Keyframes. This makes the shark go the other way. And when I move the keyframes into position, you'll see that the shark comes on the screen and then turns around and comes back. Now, to make him look like he's getting closer, let's scale up this shark. So with it selected, I'm going to type the letter S to open up the scale option, and I'll scale him up to about 43%. Additionally, I want to give a little bit of a pause while he's off screen, so I'll take the top split layer and move it out just a little bit so that it gives him time to turn around off screen. In the next video, we'll adjust the timing of some of our layers. In this video, we'll adjust the timing of some of our layers. The first thing we want to do for this exercise is make sure that we're zoomed all the way out on our timeline, and I can do that by pulling this bar all the way to the far right. Next, if I look at the title, you'll see that it only stays on the screen for 3 seconds, and I want it to rotate in and then stay on the screen. We can easily fix this without going back to Cinema 4D by right-clicking on the layer, choosing Time, and then Freeze on Last Frame. Additionally, I don't want the layer to just pop on. I want it to fade on. So I can toggle open my title layer or type the letter T to open just the opacity option. I'll type I to jump to the beginning of my layer, turn on opacity, jump to about 4 seconds 10 frames, turn on a keyframe, jump back to the first keyframe, and set the opacity to 0. This will allow it to fade in over 10 seconds. For the mermaid, I've noticed that as she swims in, her hands are moving rather slowly, and I want to speed that up. I'm going to click on the mermaid layer, type the letter U to show all the active keyframes, and I'll select them. One keyboard shortcut you can use to select keyframes is Command-Option-A or Control-Alt-A on the PC to select all the visible keyframes. However, that does not get the additional keyframes that we need. To get the additional keyframes, I'm going to hold my Shift key and click and drag across all the keyframes. If I select keyframes that I don't want to select, such as these position keyframes, I can hold my Shift key down and drag across them. If you want to see more of your keyframes, you can always toggle close some of these panels on your timeline. Now that I have my keyframes selected, I'm going to hold my Option key or Alt on the PC, click on the last keyframe, and drag. This will compress the keyframes and speed up the animation. We'll do something a little bit different with the shark. With the shark, I want him to come right up to the mermaid and stop. To do that, I'll type the letter P for the position option, add a keyframe, move forward to 10 seconds, 16 frames. I can copy the first keyframe with it selected by using Command-C or Control-C on the PC, and paste the keyframe with Command-V or Control-V. This will give the shark a little pause, but you'll notice he wiggles a little bit on the screen. With the first one selected, I can go to the graph editor and change it to a hold keyframe, or I can right-click on it and choose Toggle Hold Keyframe. Next, I want to type the letter U to open up all the active keyframes. Select everything besides the position keyframes and move them so that it's right about when he takes off again. In the next video, we'll animate some additional effects. In this video, we'll add some final effects to our composition. Now that we have our animations working, I'm going to make some changes to our composition. First thing I want to do is move this byline down a little bit. I'll click on the layer and move it down. Next, I notice that the mermaid's a little bright, and if she were underwater, she'd have a blue tint to her. To fix that, I'll go over to my Effects panel and open up the color correction effects. The first one I want to add is the CC toner. You'll see that this tints the mermaid, but these are not the colors I want. To get the right colors, I'll click on the eyedropper and choose colors from the background. For the black, I'll click on the blue and then open up the color so I can make it a dark blue. Now that's a little too much. To tone it down, I'll increase the blend with original to right about there. Additionally, I feel like her skin's a little too bright to be underwater. I'll select the brightness and contrast and drop it on top. I'll adjust the brightness, and right about there looks good. Now you can copy and paste these effects by shift-clicking to select them both, using the keyboard shortcut Command-C or Control-C if you're on a PC. And if we jump to our shark, I can select it and paste the effects. That's a little too dark for the shark, so I'll increase the brightness so he looks like he's in front of the title. On the shark in the back, I'll also paste the effects with Command-V or Control-V if you're on a PC, brighten it, and I want the shark to be behind the title, so I can either drag it underneath the title or use Command left bracket to move it down. Next, I want to add a little interest to my composition, so I'll add a lens flare. To do that, we need a solid layer, so I'll choose Layer, New, Solid Layer. Make sure that your layer color this time is black. I'll bring it to the top by using the keyboard shortcut Command, Shift, or Control Shift if you're on a PC, and the right bracket key. In my effects, I'll type in the word lens to search for the lens effect, and choose the lens flare. Now, the background is still covering our image, and we can fix that by changing the mode. With the layer selected, toggle on the Transfer Controls pane. Change the mode from Normal to Lighten. With the modes, you have different sections. When you choose the options in this section, if you have a black color, it'll darken your background. If you have white, it'll disappear. These are the lightening options, and if you have black, like you just saw, the black will disappear and the light will stay. With these options, these are 50-50 options, and each one's a little bit different, but with these options, neutral gray will disappear. Then you have some difference options that invert the colors, hue saturation, which works on the colors, and then some alphas. For the lens flare, I first want to animate it from left to right. I'll move it into position off screen. Type the letter P. Move my current time indicator to about 5 seconds. Turn on the position. Move to about 15 seconds. And move it off screen. Now, in addition to animating its position, we can also animate the flare center. I'll go back to my first keyframe, and I'll go ahead and blend with original to tone it down. I want this also behind the title, so I'll drag it down and add the toner. The last thing I want to do is add a vignette around the composition. To do that, I'll add another solid layer. Make sure that it's black. Hit OK. Use Command or Control Shift and the right bracket to bring it to the top. I'll switch over to my ellipse tool. Draw an ellipse in the middle. Change the mask from Add to Subtract. And adjust the feather or softness of the edge. Again, I'll change the mode here from Normal to Multiply and adjust the opacity by typing the letter T and lightening it up. As our animation comes to a close, we want it to fade to black. I'll toggle open the solid layer and the mask, turn the keyframe on for the mask feather, jump ahead to 15 seconds, and increase the feather and the opacity. We can also animate the expansion and bring it all the way down until it turns black. In this video, we've adjusted our layers and the timing, as well as animating some additional effects. In the next section, we'll take a look at rendering. In this section, we'll look at rendering our project. We'll learn about preview rendering, rendering 3D with an alpha, rendering in After Effects, as well as using Adobe Media Encoder to render our files. In this video, we'll take a look at rendering to our preview. First of all, what is rendering? Well, it takes an editable file like our After Effects project, and it flattens it down to a formatted file that is typically compressed. When you render files, there are many things to consider, such as where it will be displayed and how big of a file you want. But before we go too far, let's first take a look at rendering in the preview panel. Up until now, we've been scrubbing through our timeline, but that does not give us a real sense of timing. Instead, what we'll do is render the preview. You can do that in two ways, either choosing Composition, Preview, Play Current Preview, or simply hitting the spacebar on your keyboard. As the file begins to render, you'll see green lines that indicate the frames that are being rendered to the preview. You may also notice that right now our rendering is pretty slow. That's because we have the resolution set to full. Often when I work at 1/4 of the resolution, and that allows the rendering to speed up quite a bit. Now, as I render this, I notice that I really don't need anything after about 15 seconds. So rather than rendering a bunch of black space over here to the right, I'm going to trim my composition. You can easily do that by moving your work area slider to where you want the composition to end. Then go to the Composition menu and choose Trim Comp to Work Area. and now you'll see there's no longer extra footage. I'll hit the spacebar on my keyboard, and you'll see that our video is now playing in real time. In the next video, we'll look at rendering 3D with an alpha. In this video, we'll render our 3D object with an alpha. Sometimes you'll want to either render out your 3D layer on its own, or render it out with a transparent background. I'm going to show you how to do both. Now, as I mentioned before, Cinema 4D Lite does not allow you to save rendered files. However, you can still render them using After Effects. To do that, let's select our Cinema 4D file and turn it into a composition by right-clicking and choosing Pre-compose. Now, if you double-click on the composition, you'll see that our 3D file is now on a black background. It also has grid lines from the software. To turn those off, change your renderer from software to standard final. Next, if we want to render this composition, we choose the composition menu and say Add to Render Queue. In the next video, we'll take a look at these settings, but for right now, just simply click on the Output 2 and select your 07 rendering folder. I'll click Render to render it out, and because this is high res and I've not trimmed down the composition, it may take a while for it to render. Next, let's go back to our main composition and import that file by choosing File, Import File, and select it from our 07 folder. Now, if I drag that in, you'll see that the file itself is there, but it has a black background, which I don't want. I'll delete that from the composition and try something different. I'll click on my render queue, duplicate this job, and jump into the output module by clicking the word lossless. Here you'll see there's a channel option that you can change to RGB plus alpha. Alpha is simply the shape of the mask that defines the transparent areas. I'll hit OK and render again. Once that's complete, I'll come back to my main composition, choose File, Import File, our new rendered file. I'll drag it into my composition, and you'll see that this version of our render has a nice transparent background. I'll select the file that we added, delete it, and save. In the next video, we'll look at the final render in After Effects. In this video, we'll do a final render of our After Effects project. There are two ways to render. First, you can use the render queue by selecting your composition and choosing Composition, Add to Render Queue. The other way is to add it to the Adobe Media Encoder, which we'll see in the next video. A quick way to get your movie rendered. However, it does slow down your workflow if it's rendering the same time you're working. If you don't want to slow down your workflow, you should use the Adobe Media Encoder. In the render queue, the first thing to look at is to double check that you're rendering the composition that you expect. Because we clicked on the main composition and chose Add to Render Queue, it will render the main composition. Had I selected background, it would have rendered the background. Next, we'll look at the render settings. Under Quality, you see that you have Draft and Wireframe in addition to Best. The draft setting is often appropriate for reviewing or testing motion. Wireframes are basically quick and dirty renders. Because this is final, we'll keep it on Best. If you want to speed up your render time at the expense of quality, you can change your render resolution the same way we did in the preview panel. Again, this is a final render, so I'll leave it at full. The rest of these settings are advanced and out of the scope of this tutorial, so we'll leave them with the defaults. I'll click OK. And next, I'll open up the Output module by clicking on Lossless. The first thing to note is there are a lot of different formats you can render to, and we'll see even more when we look at the Media Encoder. The majority of your renders will be a QuickTime MOV. The one thing you might notice is a lot of these are image sequences. These render out one image per frame and can be imported into After Effects as a group. In addition to formats and video output, you have the ability to resize and crop your video. I'm going to turn those off, leave everything as default, and hit OK. Now when I choose Render, it'll render my file in a final MOV format. Now that our file is rendered, we have a nice QuickTime movie of our animation. In the next video, we'll look at rendering with the Adobe Media Encoder. In this video, we'll do our final render in Adobe Media Encoder. Adobe Media Encoder is a standalone application that can be used with programs such as After Effects and Premiere Pro. To get there, you can select the composition you want to export, choose the Composition menu, and select Add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. You'll see that adds the composition to the queue. Another way to do it is to find the project in the Media browser and select the composition. You can then simply drag it into the queue. I'll go ahead and delete one of the compositions by selecting it and hitting the Delete key. To open the preview panel, I'm going to click on the Format, and it opens up a preview panel very similar to what you saw in After Effects. It has a preview window, a timeline, and export settings. However, Adobe Media Encoder has a lot more presets for you to choose from than After Effects. If I change the format to QuickTime, you'll see a lot of presets that are optimized for professional video. If I change it back to H.264, which is a very common compression format, you'll see some familiar optimization settings like Facebook and Twitter. We'll set our preset to the Facebook 1080 Full HD and hit OK. Now, if I had a lot of compositions to render, I could keep adding them to this queue before hitting play. This allows me to render multiple compositions while still working in After Effects. I'll change my output destination and change it to the Chapter 7 rendering folder and hit play to render the video. You'll notice as it renders that when there are more effects on the screen, such as the Cinema 4D title, the rendering slows down. This is because that particular effect uses a lot of memory. This would be a great place to put in a pre-rendered file, such as the title movie we created in a previous video. Instead of the Cineware effect, the effect doesn't have to be calculated during render time. In this section, we looked at preview rendering, rendering 3D with an alpha mask, we did a final render in After Effects, and we also looked at a final render in Adobe Media Encoder. Thank you for completing this After Effects project with me. It's by no means complete. You should go back into the project and use things that you've learned in all of the chapters, such as the 12 principles of animation, rendering, and adding effects. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you again soon.